In the last video, we introduced some of the basic concepts associated with logic. So the general idea with logic is we're talking about the science of reasoning, learning how to structure sentences, structure an argument in such a way that even if you don't necessarily know about the content of a discussion, you can understand that an argument or a discussion is structured in a logical way. So the basic component of logic is what we call a statement. So a statement is going to be a sentence that's either true or false, but not both at the same time. Now, we know we can communicate ideas that have more than one statement at the same time. If you think about joining together two statements, you can create another statement. Now, a simple statement is going to be one that conveys a single idea. You can summarize it as one piece of information. When we combine simple statements together with what we call connectives, special words or phrases that we call connectives, we form what we call a compound statement. So a compound statement is going to communicate more than one idea at the same time. And depending upon the connecting words we use, it's going to communicate a different relationship among the statements that we're combining together. So we have 4 different connecting words and phrases. So our words are going to be and, or, if then, which will be combined in phrasing, and if and only if. So each of these connectives is going to join together our statements, but it joins them together in a specific way and expresses a particular relationship. Now, we're also going to find that with some of these words and phrases, there are alternate words that express the same kind of relationship, the same kind of logical relationship. So we use different words in the English language to communicate sort of subtle differences in meaning, but in terms of how they function logically, there are different words that may function the same way logically. So we'll talk about that as well. So let's start with the word and. Imagine taking 2 simple statements, combining them together with the word and. So something like P and Q. We call this compound statement a conjunction. So and, the symbol for and is going to be the conjunction symbol. So when we join these 2 statements, P and Q, together using the word and, this is going to be the symbolic form of that. So statement P, statement Q, and then this up arrow is going to represent and. Now this looks kind of like the intersection symbol when we talked about sets. Remember, the intersection symbol represented the word and. If you talk about one set and another set, then you're talking about their intersection. Same thing here, and notice the symbol looks very familiar. So if you remember everything we talked about in terms of sets, some of the things we talk about here are going to look very similar. Negation, kind of like the complement of a set. And here, and, we call this conjunction. The symbol for conjunction is going to look very similar to the symbol for an intersection. So let's look at these 2 simple statements. P, it is after 5 p.m. Q, they are working. We want to represent each of the following statements in symbolic form. It is after 5 p.m. and they are working. So you need to think about all the components of this sentence. What represents a statement? What represents the connective? Start with the connective word though. Here's and, here's our connective. It's joining together 2 ideas. So one idea is it is after 5 p.m. and the other idea is they are working. Well, it is after 5 p.m. is the statement P. They are working is the statement Q. So we have P and Q. So when we write that symbolically, that's going to be P, conjunction, Q. That's going to be our symbolic form. Okay, it is after 5 p.m. and they are not working. So there's 2 things here. There's the word and, there's our connective, but we also have that word not. We talked about not in the last video. Not represents negation. It represents expressing the opposite idea from the original idea communicated by the statement. Our symbol for the word not is the tilde, the little squiggle symbol. So if we think about removing those 2 words, which are not part of the statements, they're additions to the statements, we still have it is after 5 p.m. and we have they are working. If we removed that and that not. So we have P and they are not working would be not Q. So P, conjunction, not Q, negation of Q. So we can combine different symbols together, and that's actually what we're going to do further on in this video. We're going to talk about what happens when you combine multiple statements together in different ways with different kinds of symbols. Now, the logical and relationship, one and the other, can also be expressed with other types of words. These words are going to convey a different kind of meaning in terms of how we interpret the relationship in English, but they still mean the same thing here logically. They mean we're using this conjunction operation. So it is after 5 p.m. and they are working could also be expressed logically in these different ways. It is after 5 p.m., but they are working. So the word but also represents conjunction. It represents this particular symbol joining together our statements. But we know that but means something very different than and. It means a different kind of relationship in terms of how the two simple ideas are being joined together. It is after 5 p.m., yet they are working. Same kind of thing, different meaning. It is after 5 p.m., nevertheless, they are working. All of these words represent conjunction, logical conjunction, but in English, they communicate slightly different ideas. The next connective we have is the word or, joining two simple statements together with the word or. Now, just like when we talked about or, when we talked about sets, or was representative of the union of two sets, joining them together. The word or in English has two different meanings. There's two different ways of interpreting the word or. Exclusive or is probably what you think of when you think the word or, one or the other. So exclusive or means one or the other, but not both. We're not allowing both. So I could go here or I could go there, but because I want to go at one particular time of day, I can't do both. So I can do this or I can do that, but I can't do both. Inclusive or means one or the other and possibly both. I could go do something with this friend, or I could do something with this friend, or maybe we could all do something together. I can do something with both friends. Inclusive or means one or the other and possibly both. Now, when we talk about the term or in mathematics, in logic, we're using the inclusive or. We're allowing for the possibility of both. So the statement P or Q, again, represents inclusive or. We call this statement a disjunction, and the disjunction symbol is going to be a down arrow. So notice, like with the and looks similar to the intersection symbol, the conjunction looks similar to the intersection symbol, the disjunction looks similar to a union, and the same word indicates that particular symbol. So or means a union for sets, a disjunction for statements, and then and means an intersection for sets, or a conjunction if we're talking about statements. So let's do a little bit more symbolic translation. So P is the bill receives majority approval, Q is the bill becomes a law. And we want to write these compound statements in symbolic form. The bill receives majority approval, or the bill becomes a law. So here's our connective. That's what's joining the two individual ideas, the simple statements, together. And then we have the bill receives majority approval, which is P, and the bill becomes a law, which is Q. So we have P or Q, which is going to be P disjunction Q. Now what about this one? The bill receives majority approval, or the bill does not become a law. Okay, now we've introduced the word not. Again, not represents negation. It represents taking an idea and communicating the opposite piece of information. So if we take away the disjunction and the negation, those are the additional things not directly associated with the individual statements that we started with. We have the bill receives majority approval, P. The bill becomes a law, which is Q. So the bill does not become a law is going to be not Q. And then we have P or not Q. So P, disjunction, not Q. Okay, so or and those are connectives you're familiar with. You use those terms in real life. The only one, again, we have to be careful about is the word or. In our case, or means inclusive. We're including the possibility that both could be true at the same time rather than just exclusively one or the other. Now, the next connective is going to be a phrasing. It's the phrasing if, then. So if blah, 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 then blah, blah, blah. So we're not joining together statements in the same way. We're joining them together in a relationship that suggests causality. In other words, one causes the other, or requirement. One has to be true in order for the other to be true. It's a requirement. One implies the truth of the other. So for instance, the statement, all poets are writers. If we were to think of this in terms of a diagram representing this relationship between being a poet, you could think of that as one statement, and being a writer. Someone is a poet, someone is a writer. Well, if we say that all poets are writers, then that means the category of poets fits within the category of writers. If we were to think in terms of a Venn diagram, that's sort of a partial Venn diagram that we could use to communicate that relationship between being a poet and being a writer. In order to be in the poets category, you already have to fit within the writers category. In order to be a poet, the person must also already be a writer. In other words, in order for the first statement to apply, in order to say that a person is a poet, the second statement has to be true. The person has to be a writer. So one statement's truth is necessary for the other statement's truth. One statement causes the other. One statement is required for the other to be true. So it's not necessarily two independent statements that are true at the same time, kind of like one statement and another, one statement or another, things that can really be separated. Here we're expressing a relationship where one implies the other. It's sort of a cause and effect kind of thing. So the statement if P, then Q is what we call a conditional. It expresses a condition for something to be true. And the symbol we're going to use is an actual arrow. So P implies Q. That's one way to read this. So if P, then Q, we could also read it as P implies Q, P conditional Q. So the first statement is what we call the antecedent, not anti, but ante. Ante means before. Antebellum means before the war. So when we use the term antebellum, we mean before the Civil War in the United States. So antecede means to come before. So this statement comes before. It is the antecedent. We also call this the sufficient part. It is sufficient for P to be true to say that Q is true. It's sufficient to say that someone is a poet to be able to say that that person is a writer. That's not the only way for a person to be qualified as a writer, but if that person is a poet, then that's a sufficient condition to say that that person is also a writer. Now the second statement is what we call the consequent. It's the consequence of the first one being true. It's what we call the necessary part. In order for P to be true, it must be the case that Q is already true. It's necessary for Q to be true in order for P to be true. It's necessary for someone to be a writer in order to say that someone is a poet. You can't be a poet if you're not already a writer. It's necessary to be a writer in order to say that one is a poet. So let's write a couple of these. Now we're going to have to be careful about the order things come in. So the order we write the statements in is dependent upon how the sentence is structured. So how we represent these things symbolically is very much dependent upon the ordering in the sentence. So our first statement, P, a person is a father. The second statement, a person is male. So if a person is a father, then that person is male. So here we have two parts of our connective. The if and the then are considered to be one unit. So both of those words have to be removed if we're just going to analyze the statements individually. So if we remove those two terms, we have a person is a father, which is P, and we have that person is male, or we can say that as a person is male, which is Q. So if P, then Q, the way we'd write that is P conditional Q. P implies Q. So if P, then Q, P implies Q. If a person is male, then that person is a father. So again, take away the if then. A person is male is Q. Person is a father, that's going to be P. So notice it's the same statements, but now they're in the opposite order. So if a person is male, if Q, then that person is a father, then P. So Q, conditional P. Q implies P. If a person is not male, then that person is not a father. So not male would be not Q. Not a father would be not P. So if not Q, then not P. Not Q implies not P. So as the statements get more complex, there's a few things going on here. We're going to kind of diagram the sentence in a way. You want to think of breaking down the sentence into its components. Most importantly, what represents a connective, or some word that's sort of separate from the statements. It's outside the statements. It's something we're using from a logical sense. What represents a statement and what represents those kinds of words. You want to diagram the sentence so you can identify those different components, and that's going to help you structure the correct symbolic representations for your compound statements. Now, just like the word and, we can use if then, or we can communicate if then in different ways, just different wordings, maybe more complex wordings that we really need, but just different ways of saying the same thing, communicating the same relationship using different wording. So suppose we're looking at the statement, if a person is a father, then that person is male. So the first one, in other words, P implies Q. Another way of saying this is Q if P. So the way that would be worded here would be a person is male if that person is a father. Now, because we're communicating the same meaning here in a different way, we need to make sure that, again, the truth, the falseness relationship has to be the same. So if we're trying to communicate the same statement in a different way, a true statement should remain true, a false statement should remain false. So our first statement, is it true, is it false? If a person is a father, then that person has to be male. Well, aside from any gender issues, anything like that, in general, we would say that statement is true. If it's the case that a person is a father, then it has to be the case that that person is a male. It's sufficient for a person to be a father to say that that person is male. It's necessary to be male to say that the person is a father. So that is a true statement. Well, what happens when we reword it? Q if P. A person is male if that person is a father. Well, that would still be a true statement. So it communicates the same idea. It still uses the word if. The word then is eliminated because we've rearranged how the statements are structured. Okay, P is sufficient for Q. Being a father is sufficient for being male. Essentially, when we word it like this is a way of describing the sufficient part and the necessary part. So the sufficient part is always the first statement. The first statement, being a father, is sufficient for the second statement, for being male. Now we can flip it. Q is necessary for P. Q is the consequence, the antecedent, the consequent. This is the sufficient part, this is the necessary part. So Q is necessary for P. Q, being male, is necessary for P, for being a father. So being male is necessary for being a father. Q is necessary for P. P only if Q. This is a necessary kind of thing again. A person is a father only if that person is male. Or we can flip it, same construct, flipped order. Only if a person is male is that person a father. Now these last two in particular might be kind of weird to word, but again, like we talked about in the last video, ideally you want to communicate things in the most straightforward way possible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the communication you encounter in life will always be written that way. So you need to be able to look at different constructs and understand what's the essence of the meaning, what's really being communicated if you take away all the fancy wording and just really think about the structure of what's being said, what's being communicated. So all of these are different ways of expressing that same relationship right there, just using different combinations of wording. So let's look at an example where we need to put a little bit more together and we need to use some of this rewording. So P is we suffer huge budget deficits, and Q is we control government spending. We want to write the following compound statement in symbolic form. Controlling government spending is necessary for not suffering huge budget deficits. Now here's where we're going to diagram. I talked about diagramming it a little bit. We want to think about what represents a statement and what represents a connective or some type of logical component. So start with the actual statements. We suffer huge budget deficits. Okay, suffering huge budget deficits. Well, that's there. Notice we have the word not, though. So not suffering huge budget deficits is going to be not P. We control government spending. Controlling government spending. Okay, so that's there. It doesn't have a not, so it's just going to be Q. Now here's where it gets interesting. The connective has been expressed not as if-then, not as an actual just straightforward conditional, but we've used one of these equivalent terminologies. We've used the term is necessary. So we're saying something is necessary for something else. Now we have to think about what part is the sufficient part and what part is the necessary part. The sufficient part implies the necessary part. So the arrow will always be pointing towards the necessary part. So if we're saying this is necessary for, we're saying this is the necessary part in our compound statement. This is necessary for, not P for this particular statement. So even though we typically orient the arrow from left to right, if we're going to write this statement, if we're going to interpret it literally based on where everything is, that means the arrow is actually pointing in the opposite direction. This is necessary. This is the necessary part, which means the arrow has to be pointing towards that part. Now, when we actually write the symbolic interpretation, we want to rearrange it and write it in the correct order with the arrow pointing from left to right. So that's going to be not P implies Q. This is the ordering we get just from the structure of the sentence, but when we write the symbolic form, we're going to write it in the correct order, going from left to right. Okay, let's look at another one. Now, don't forget these two statements. We suffer huge budget deficits. We control government spending. Okay. New ones. I thought we were about to use the same ones. New ones. P, you exercise regularly. Q, you increase your chances of a heart attack. Okay. We want to, again, represent this statement in symbolic form, just based on what we know about the wording, about the connective, about the statements here. Thought for a second we were going to use the same statements, which is why I said remember those, but turns out we don't need them. New statements. Okay. Not exercising regularly is sufficient for increasing your chances of a heart attack. Okay. Not exercising regularly. Well, you exercise regularly. There's exercising regularly, so that's going to be the part associated with P. Now, we've also introduced the word not. So that means rather than having P, we're going to have not P. Is sufficient for, that is our connective. Remember, that is one version of a substitute for if-then, for our conditional. So I'm going to box that in. You can circle it, you can box it, do something to indicate that that is somehow separate from your statements. And then the last part of the sentence, increasing your chances of a heart attack. Well, you have the second statement, you increase your chances of a heart attack, increasing your chances of a heart attack. Okay, so that is the statement Q. Now, the is sufficient for part, we have to remember again what we're looking at when we look at the if-then. So the antecedent, the part that comes before, is the sufficient part. The part that comes after is the necessary part. So we're saying this is sufficient. It is the sufficient part, which means this, not P, is the sufficient part. It's going to be the part that comes before the arrow. So that means our arrow is going to be pointing away from this, since this comes before the arrow. So not P implies Q, and that's going to be our structure there. So notice in this case, the arrow was already oriented correctly, getting tongue-tied, already oriented correctly. In that case, we can just write it left to right. But again, just to review, the last one, it was not oriented in the standard order. Standard order is we write it from left to right with the arrow oriented that way. So we're going to rearrange that when we put it in symbolic form in order to have it in the most logical, the easiest to interpret way. So notice those two structures were actually the same, even though the sentences were worded and structured in a different way. Now our last connective is similar, but it's going to be if and only if, which is similar to if then, but it takes it one step further. So if both P implies Q and Q implies P are true, or we're assuming both are the case, we want to indicate both at the same time, then we can actually combine the conditionals. What results is the statement P if and only if Q, which is what we call a biconditional. It means the conditional in both directions. Bi means two, it means both in this case. So conditional in both directions. And so it's going to be a double-sided arrow, which means P is pointing towards Q and Q is pointing towards P. Now, because if and only if is kind of a pain to write, you wouldn't want to have to write it that many times, we actually abbreviate it as if, double F. Double F is double F's in your if. So that's going to be our abbreviation for if and only if we want to write it in words rather than writing it symbolically. So again, if and only if means P implies the truth of Q and Q implies the truth of P. So for example, P is a person is an unmarried man, Q is a person is a bachelor. So we want to write each of the following statements in symbolic form. A person is an unmarried man if and only if that person is a bachelor. So a person is an unmarried man, that's going to be P. That person is a bachelor, a person is a bachelor, that's going to be Q. And then our connective is the if and only if. So P, if and only if, Q. P, biconditional, Q. Notice in this case, kind of what the biconditional means, it's almost sort of a definition. It's sort of representing a definition. If one implies the other and the opposite relationship is true, then it means both statements essentially are communicating the same idea, just in a different way. So saying that a person is an unmarried man and saying that a person is a bachelor essentially communicates the same idea, which is why the biconditional can be used in this sense. Bachelor is another term for unmarried man. So one implies the other in both directions. Okay, what about this one? A person is not a bachelor if and only if that person is not an unmarried man. So a person is not a bachelor, that's going to be not Q. That person is not an unmarried man, that's going to be not P. And if and only if, that's going to be our biconditional. So not Q, biconditional, not P. That's going to be our symbolic notation. As it turns out, these two statements are actually logically equivalent. In terms of structuring it with the double not and the biconditional, those two statements actually communicate the same idea. One uses negation and one uses the positive versions of the statements. Now some other wordings here, again, this will get completely messy. If and only if is a mess to write, imagine complicating that particular language even further. But it can happen, and you need to know to be able to read it and interpret what you're looking at. So suppose we're using the statement, a person is an unmarried man if and only if that person is a bachelor. In other words, the first one. Another way of saying that is if P then Q, in other words, P implies Q, we can go from left to right, and if Q then P, which means we can also go right to left. So essentially what this particular structure is doing is it's breaking down the biconditional into the two separate conditional statements that make it up. One implies the other and vice versa. So in terms of these statements, a person is an unmarried man, a person is a bachelor. That's going to be if a person is an unmarried man, if P, then that person is a bachelor, then Q. And, in other words, conjunction, we've seen that before, right? And if a person is a bachelor, if Q, then that person is an unmarried man, then P. So left to right, then right to left, both together at the same time, but now they've been broken up into the two separate statements. Another way of saying this is P is necessary and sufficient for Q. The way we would word that here would be being an unmarried man is sufficient and necessary for being a bachelor. Remember, sufficient and necessary defined what came before and what came after the conditional. Well, if any particular statement is both sufficient and necessary, remember the sufficient condition comes before the arrow, the necessary condition comes after the arrow. So that means one particular statement comes both before and after the arrow. Well, the only way it can become before and after is if the arrow points in both directions. So here P comes before the arrow that goes left to right, and here it also comes after the arrow that points from right to left. So it's both necessary and sufficient. You can orient those words in either way too. We can say sufficient and necessary, or we could also say necessary and sufficient. So that's going to be our four connectives. Those are the four different ways we can combine statements. Each of them communicates a different relationship between the statements. Now we're going to put them together. So what happens when we add in more? How do we communicate multiple ideas with multiple connectives involving negation as well? We're going to convert in both ways. So if we've got symbols, how do we put it in words? If we've got words, how do we put it in symbols? Now, just like with algebra, just like with our set operations, we do have a hierarchy of operations and the order we have to do them in. So if there are parentheses, we have to pay attention to that. Parentheses group things. So just like they group things in terms of grouping set operations, grouping algebraic operations, they can group connectives. So they can group intermediate parts within the compound statement. So particularly when a statement contains negation, we have to be careful about how things are grouped. So if we're taking an entire compound statement, one statement, another statement joined together with a connective, if we want to negate that entire thing, how do we indicate that the entire compound statement is negated? Well, it's not going to be sufficient to put the word not. The word not is typically only used when we want to negate a single simple statement. But if we want to negate a compound statement, negate the whole thing, what we can use is this phrase, it is not true that. So we'll express the compound statement, put it in words, and in front of that we can put it is not true that, or it is not the case that. And then you can list the compound statement. So whenever we see that wording indicates that we're negating the entire compound statement that comes after it. We're taking that whole thing as one particular unit, we're negating it as one single unit. Now, what if we don't have any parentheses? Negation in that case only applies to the statement that immediately follows. It's the same kind of thing if you see a negative in something algebraic. If you put parentheses around something and you have a negative outside the parentheses, well, that means the negative applies to everything in parentheses. If you don't have any parentheses, then the negative only applies to what it's right next to. Same thing with negation. If there's no parentheses, the word not, the negation, only applies to the statement that immediately follows it, not any type of compound, not anything that follows after that. Now, when we're putting things in words and there's groupings, we do have to indicate this. The way we're going to indicate this is with commas. So once we end a particular grouping and start another grouping, we have to indicate it with a comma. Here, don't think too literally in terms of this comma has to go here because this is where something stopped. You're going to have to think about the general rules for mechanics, how you actually structure a sentence. Where does the comma actually go? You're going to put it there. Things before the comma are considered to be 1 unit. Things after the comma are also considered to be 1 unit. So let's try a few examples. We'll start with 2 statements, and then we're going to add on a third, and we'll look at 3 at a time. So keep them simple. First statement, she is wealthy. P, she is wealthy. Q, she is happy. Okay, so we're going to be given the symbols, and we want to put the symbols in words. We want to translate from symbolic form to actual words using these defined statements. So negation of P and Q. P conjunction Q. So remember the up arrow, that means and. That is a conjunction, okay? So negated P and Q. Well, just like any other situation, start inside parentheses. Think about what happens inside parentheses. P and Q, how would we write that in words? Well, P and Q would be she is wealthy and she is happy. Well, now we're taking that entire statement and we want to express its negation. But notice we're not just negating P, we're not just negating Q, we're negating the whole statement. This is where we use that phrasing, it is not true that. So she is wealthy and she is happy, P and Q. It is not true that P and Q. So it is not true that means we're negating the whole statement. Now again, as we talked about with sets, there are spots where it's tempting to try to apply a rule that does not actually apply. There is no distributive property here. You cannot distribute that negation into parentheses. It acts like a negative, but it is not an algebraic operation. You have to use this phrasing to indicate that we're negating the whole compound statement. You can't just negate P, negate Q, and put an and between them. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So this phrasing is going to take care of it for you, and that tells us we're negating the whole conjunction at that point. Okay, what if we take away the parentheses? Notice that's the only thing that changed from one statement to the next. It is a different statement though, and it is communicating a different idea. So not P, conjunction Q, not P and Q. So here the negation is only applying to P. P is the only thing we're going to add the word not to. Now because we're only negating one statement, we can truly use the word not. We don't have to use that phrase, it is not true that. We're just going to express the negation of that single statement. So not P would be she is wealthy, but she is not wealthy. Conjunction and then Q would be she is happy. So she is not wealthy and she is happy. Now, if we were going to express this maybe a little bit more idiomatically, instead of using the word and, you might use the word but instead. The idea that you're contrasting these two states. If you think of wealth and happiness as kind of going together, one implying the other. If you're wealthy, you're happy. If you're happy, you're wealthy, something like that. In this case, we might try to express this in sort of a contrasting sense. She is not wealthy, but she is still happy, something like that. So you can use the word and, which would be the literal translation. But remember, there are other words that express the same logical relationship. And in this case, but would be a substitute to the word and that would still work the same way logically, but maybe communicates the idea in a slightly different way, just depending on what sort of meaning you wanted this sentence to have. Okay, one more. Not negated, P disjunction, I was about to say conjunction, P disjunction Q. In other words, P or Q. So negated, P or Q. Now again, we have to express the compound statement in parentheses, and then we have to negate that whole statement. So P or Q is she is wealthy or she is happy. She is wealthy or she is happy. And then we're negating the whole thing. In order to negate the whole thing, we're going to use that phrasing. So it is not true that, it is not the case that she is wealthy or she is happy. Okay. Now, let's add on. Same kind of structures, but now let's look at what happens when we have 3 statements instead of 2 statements. Same idea, we just want to take it step by step, think of what the parentheses mean. Here, we're really going to have to pay attention to the comma idea. We didn't have to use any of the commas above because notice that the groupings weren't separated from other parts in terms of the compound statement. So once we closed the parentheses, we were done. If we'd had other things outside of parentheses, either before or after, that's where the commas would come into play. The commas will then group us and show us where the parentheses ended and then where we continue on with the compound statement. So here, P is going to be a student misses lecture, Q is a student studies, R is a student fails. So in words, we want to take these symbolic statements, translate them. So Q and not P implies not R. Okay, now particularly when we have the conditional. Remember, conditional is not just one word in the middle, it's the if then. So the if goes out front, the then goes in the middle. What's going to happen here, particularly as you're learning to write these, is the first time you try them, your words may not quite fit where they need to, which means you take it and you rework it. Think of it as a rough draft. Each translation is then a rough draft, and then you fix it a little bit to get to your final draft. So translate it literally to start, and then maybe move things around where they need to go. Where might that become a problem here? Well, if you don't see the conditional to start with, then you don't know to put the if out front. If you just start translating what's in parentheses, then you won't necessarily know to put an if out front. So just start translating, go left to right, and then if you need to go back and add something, go back and add something, that's fine. So just using parentheses, we'll start in there. So Q and not P, Q and not P. So a student studies and a student does not miss lecture. So a student studies and the student does not miss lecture. Notice I omitted the word student, that's okay. It's the same subject. The subject is going to be the same for all these statements. What's changing is the predicate. So we can use the new verbs, and we know we're still talking about the same subject. If you want to put student in every time, it's fine. If you want to kind of omit it here and there, that's going to be fine as well. So a student studies and does not miss lecture. Now notice that's where the parentheses close, and then there's other things in the statement. So because that's where we've closed the parentheses, that's where we're going to put a comma. Now I have the conditional. So that is going to be the antecedent for the conditional. That's when I have the arrow. Now I know the arrow is translated as if then, but the if comes before whatever we're representing as the antecedent. So we'll technically need to put the if out front. So a student studies and does not miss lecture. That's going to be this literally, but the conditional says we need to put an if out front. So if a student studies and does not miss lecture, then fill in the blank, then not R. So it's not the case that a student fails. The student does not fail. So if a student studies and does not miss lecture, then that student does not fail. And notice that makes sense. If you read that sentence, it makes sense. It's not stilted, it's not difficult to understand what's being communicated there. Now again, as you're learning this and you're translating very literally, you may end up with a sentence that just seems a little bit off. Usually there's a way to adjust your sentence just a little bit. One thing that'll happen sometimes is you'll put the comma in a particular location because that's where the parentheses end, but technically it kind of has to be moved a little bit. You're still indicating the grouping, but you want to indicate it using correct grammar and correct mechanics if you can. So again, think of maybe the first time you write your sentence, think of it as your rough draft. Go back and reread it after you write it though, and make sure the sentence actually makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, then tweak it. Go back and look at all your wording, tweak it a little bit, make sure you're communicating the same logical ideas, but make sure your sentence is written and communicated well. Okay, let's look at another one. Same operations, different grouping. It does make a difference. So Q and, in parentheses, not P implies not R. So it's all the same parts, but having that different grouping means we're communicating a different meaning. It's a different compound statement. So if we just work left to right, here we go. So Q, a student studies, and notice I put a comma. We'll talk about that in a minute. And not P implies not R. So not P, a student misses lecture. Not R, a student fails. Now it's not P implies not R. So if not P, then not R. So if not P, if a student does not miss lecture, then not R, a student does not fail. If a student does not miss lecture, then that student does not fail. So if a student does not miss lecture, the student doesn't fail, he doesn't fail, she doesn't fail, they don't fail. Different wordings communicate the same thing. Now let's talk about the comma. How do you know where to put the comma here? Well, we also have to consider things that come before the grouping. So here's the grouping. The comma is going to indicate that there is a grouping, that things that come before, things that come after the comma are separate. In this case, versus the previous one, the parentheses come later. They come after that first statement that was then combined with and. So we have a student studies, forget about the comma, a student studies, and if a student does not miss lecture, then the student does not fail. Where would you put the comma logically? You'd put it right before the conjunction. And that makes sense, and it does apply towards the grouping rule. That's going to separate the grouping from what comes before it. So if we put it right there, that's separating the Q from everything that was in parentheses. But it does make sense grammatically. Grammatically, that would be where we put that particular comma, and it does result in a sentence that actually makes sense, that's structured correctly. Now, what happens if parentheses are not included? What do? We still have to write something that's correct. We still have to write something that makes sense. But how do we know how to structure it so that we're communicating the right idea, communicating what's actually intended in terms of the meaning of the statement? If there are no parentheses provided, then we use the rules of dominance, which are kind of like the order of operations. Different operations are more important or more dominant than other operations. So when we don't have parentheses, we're going to group the statements before and after the most dominant connective. Again, this thinking kind of like in terms of order of operations, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Well, if we don't have parentheses, we would just go down that list in order, right? So when we're talking about connectives, dominance goes in this order. Biconditional, if we have one, that will be the most dominant connective. So if we have a biconditional and there's no parentheses involved, we're grouping everything before and after the biconditional. That will be the grouping, that will be the implied grouping that we're going to follow. Now the next most dominant one is going to be conditional. You group everything before and after the conditional. If there's both, then we'll focus on the most dominant one. It's hierarchy, it's precedence. Biconditional takes precedence over conditional. Now the next ones are going to be conjunction and disjunction. They actually have equal dominance in this case. So you can think of those as just kind of working left to right. And then the last one will be negation. Typically we're not going to have to worry about negation as being a dominant connective, just because it's not really connecting anything, and any sentence we're looking at, any compound statement we're looking at is going to have more than just a negation in it. So now we're going to go in the opposite direction. We've still got our statements defined, but now we have a sentence, and we want to take the sentence and we want to put it in symbolic form. So what do you need to pay attention to here? Number one, pay attention to the connectives. I would recommend start by identifying those. What words represent something logical? What words are you looking for? You're looking for the word and, the word or, the word not, if then, if and only if. You're looking for all of those. Identify those first, maybe circle them, maybe box them in, highlight them, something like that, because the rest of the words in the sentence are then going to represent your statements. So get all of those words out of the way, because those are the words that are going to split up the statements. Once you see where the statements are being split from one another, it's going to be easier to identify them and label them. So P is I fail the course, Q is I study hard, and R is I pass the final. Okay, so first sentence, if I do not study hard or I do not pass the final, then I fail the course. Okay, start with your connectives. So if I study hard, or, okay, so or is a connective, I do not pass the final, then, so if then, remember they go in a pair, but let's just box in the then, because we know the then indicates where we're going to write the symbol. We're going to write the symbol separating things before and after then. So or, and then, notice we also have a couple of nots, so you might box those in as well if you want, or maybe think of not as just going with the statement that it's then embedded in, and you just know to write the negation of that statement. So now that we know where those are, we'll work left to right, and then also notice there's a comma. We'll come back to that. If I do not study hard, so I do not study hard. So I study hard, that's Q. I do not study hard, so not Q. Or is going to be my disjunction, excuse me, that's a disjunction. I always get them confused. Conjunction, disjunction, this is disjunction. Hey, they go in alphabetical order. So conjunction, disjunction, and or, think about them in that order. So this is going to be a disjunction. Okay, I do not pass the final. So I pass the final is R. I do not pass the final, not R. So far, not Q or not R. Then, the if then, that's where we have our conditional. I fail the course, so P. Okay, and notice that one's positive, it doesn't need a negation. So the literal translation is here, literally translating all of the words into either a statement or a connective. That's going to be what we get. Now it's hard to see because I've written over a bunch of stuff, but there's a comma right there before the then. The comma indicates the grouping. The comma tells us the things before and the things after are grouped. So the things before the comma, we have this particular phrase, I do not study hard or I do not pass the final. So that means everything before that comma is considered to be one grouped unit. So that's going to be where we put our parentheses. Everything before the comma is understood to be grouped. So I'm going to put parentheses around everything before the comma, and then I have the arrow, and then I have P. Now I don't need to put parentheses around P. There's nothing to group there. It's one simple statement. Grouping there is not really going to make a difference. Now notice here the grouping did actually follow the rule of dominance. The most dominant thing we have in terms of symbols is going to be the conditional. But notice we already grouped around that symbol just based on the fact that there was already a comma. So this would be the correct grouping just based on using the rules for dominance. But if we have the commas, we can just use the comma to indicate what we need to do. Now this next one does not have a comma, so we're going to have to use that rule for dominance. Okay, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. Okay, start with your connectives. I do not fail the course if and only if. Okay, so that phrasing, that represents a connective, that is a biconditional. So if and only if is biconditional. I study hard and, okay, so there's another connective, there's my conjunction, I pass the final. So once we take care of those, we know everything else is associated with a statement. So I do not fail the course. I fail the course is P, so I do not fail the course, not P. I study hard, so that's going to be Q. I pass the final, that's going to be R. So literally translating, we have not P, biconditional, Q, and R. So we write it straight across, but then we need to worry about grouping. Grouping is good because it indicates really the relationship among all of the statements. What are we really trying to communicate? If we're not giving any grouping to start with, we want to group it so that our statement is more meaningful, whether it's in words or whether it's symbolic. Now here we're going to use the rules for dominance because there's no implied grouping from the commas. So the most dominant connective is a biconditional. We have a biconditional in this statement. So that means everything before the biconditional is one thing, everything after is another thing. So that means I need to put parentheses around the Q and R in order to indicate that that's one unit, and that's going to be the second part, the part after the biconditional. Now again, not P doesn't need parentheses because we don't have to separate it from anything else on that other side of the biconditional. So this is going to be the correct version of our symbolic statement. Okay, one more. I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. Now here we have a comma. So let's see what happens here. And if I'm not mistaken, this is actually the same sentence. The only difference is the comma that we put in. So our diagramming and our translation should actually be the same here. So if and only if, that's our biconditional, and that's our conjunction. I do not fail the course, it's going to be not P. I study hard, that's going to be Q. And I pass the final, that's going to be R. The only difference here is the fact that there is a comma, whereas there wasn't one before. So if we were going to read this aloud, paying attention to the comma, actually reading with the comma, it would be, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final, because the comma always means you pause. Because that comma is there, we pay attention to the comma, we adhere to what the comma is telling us to do rather than the rules of dominance. So dominant rules only apply when we don't have a comma telling us how to group. So because this is the comma, we're going to separate everything before and everything after the comma. So that means the grouping is going to be around not P if and only if Q. And then we have the conjunction, and then we have R after our comma. So notice the exact same wording, but having a comma versus not having a comma changes the structure, and it also changes the meaning of the sentence. So in this case, having that made a big difference. Now when we write a sentence, ideally we want to write the commas in order to indicate exactly what we're trying to communicate. The commas make it clearer, just like if we have something algebraic, having parentheses makes it clearer. It tells the reader or whoever's looking at the problem exactly what we're intending. So having that is really good practice if you're going to write your own sentences and when you're going to translate. So we've talked about our 4 connectives. We know how to link together simple statements in order to communicate different types of ideas. What we're going to look at in the next video is how we would take something like a compound statement and start to talk about truth and then falseness. Ultimately, that's not really the focus in the sense of, can we look at a statement and do we understand whether that statement is true or false? What we're going to focus on is what can we determine based on the structure. Just based on the structure of the statement we're looking at, what would indicate that that structure represents something true? What would indicate that that structure represents something false?